Hello, hello. When you woke up this morning, I bet you didn't expect to fall in love with a necromancer. At least not any new ones. Well, prepare yourself for today's horror story, written by A Mysterious Lurker.
The lead detective of our department retired, and I was his replacement. Our department served a small town, only a few thousand people, so I only inherited one cold case of a missing woman. Since it was over 20 years old, all the leads had been thoroughly picked over. As I dug into the case, I found there was a very likely suspect. He was seen giving her a ride the same day she disappeared. Aside from him admitting he gave her a ride, there was no other proof of foul play on his part. Later, he was arrested for killing 2 other women, exactly like the missing girl. Over 20 years, he admitted nothing about other cases. Everyone in town knew it had to be him who did something to the missing Mary. 2 days after the lead detective retired, the man died of a heart attack in prison. The entire situation was simply unfair. She was so like his other victims, it wasn't likely he just dropped her off somewhere unharmed. He always hinted at having more victims buried, but now it was impossible to know. The bastard took it to the grave. I still went over the case, desperately trying to dig up anything I could. I was working long hours and arrived before anyone else, and I was still there when they left and the night crew came in. I had taken a break by the coffee machine to pour my 5th cup for the night when I heard 2 janitors talking. I was only half paying attention, not wanting to listen into their affairs, but something they said made me eavesdrop. Ross, the older cleaner, had taken his wife to a man who was known around town as a psychic. Rumor has it, he's able to talk to the dead. Ross's mother-in-law had just passed away. They went to him for some sort of information, and the man ended up digging an entire side of the family no one knew about. His mother-in-law had given up a baby for adoption before his wife was born, and not a soul knew until the psychic started to dig. However, he did not claim to come by the information with powers people assumed he had. He simply stated he was just really good at digging up dirt on people. He did not want payment, and refused to call up the spirit of the deceased mother, claiming any further information would just bring harm to the family. The janitors moved away from me and started to work. For the next few days, the idea rattled inside my head. I hated how the thought rotted away in my brain. I was trying to justify going to a complete stranger for help on a case. I wanted to show him what was available to the public and keep it unofficial. It was like hiring a private investigator. I hated how many good reasons my mind came up with, even though he was a man claiming to have special powers, or at least didn't do a good job quashing the rumors saying he did. Legally, getting his help was in a big gray area. I kept telling myself this was a bad idea. But that next Saturday, I found myself getting his name and driving to his place out of town. It was just outside town, surrounded by cornfields. It was in the middle of summer, so the corn had just started to grow. His house was an old farmhouse and looked like it hadn't been updated for at least 100 years. I wondered if it even had indoor plumbing. I walked onto the wooden porch, it creaking the entire time. I knocked on the door a few times. An old beat-up car was in the driveway, but that didn't mean he was home. That car didn't look like it could even run. "Hello? Mr. Hot?" I called out and knocked again. I thought I heard faint, clucking noises coming from the back. There was a big backyard, so maybe he owned chickens. I would check behind the house, then leave. After all, I didn't actually think he would be of any help to me. I just wanted to get rid of the thoughts invading my work efforts. "Mr. Hot," I called out once again when I was halfway to the back.
"Just come around back. I'm too busy to meet you."
A man's voice called out to me. I was right about the chickens. He must have had 100 of them roaming around. There were impressive-looking coops lined up behind the house. Each coop had its own theme. One looked like a dollhouse, and another looked like a courthouse. Clearly, someone put some time into building them. A tall man was working away measuring wood, starting on building another house for his pets. These had to be pets. I didn't think someone who put time and money into such complex and impressive structures could kill the chickens he spoiled. They must be for eggs only. The man I was looking for had his back turned to me. Hunched over a board of wood he was measuring for a new house. By the looks of it, he was trying to make a mini castle. A chicken sat over the table he was working on, overlooking his progress. He straightened up to address me, and I saw just how tall and thin he was. His black hair was long and tied back out of his face. Dirt covered him from his long day of work. His clothing was meant for chores, based on the holes and faded color of his jeans and button-down shirt. He looked pretty normal, until he turned around, and my eyes were met by a pair of red ones.
"They're colored contacts,"
he explained when he saw my surprised expression.
"Can I help you, Mr.?"
He was looking me over, trying to figure out if we had ever met before, or if he was expecting me. I wanted to call ahead of time, but found it impossible to find his number. "I'm Detective Charles Moore." I was hoping. That was all I could get out before finding myself with a face full of angry feathers. For some baffling reason, he had thrown the chicken that had been sitting on the table right into my face. It had fluttered and lost feathers trying to get back into the ground safely. He tried to run from me, only to trip over his own tools, falling flat onto his face. On reflex, my body moved. In under 10 seconds, he was handcuffed on the ground. I had no reason to handcuff him, aside from a face full of chicken. If he was running from me, then I wanted to at least know why. "Did you seriously just toss a chicken at me?" I asked as I helped him to sit up.
"No comment,"
he muttered. "If I uncuff you, are you gonna do it again?"
"No comment,"
he said more harshly, sticking his nose up. "You should at least apologize to the chicken." He ignored me for a few seconds, then very softly said a small,
"Sorry, Betty,"
to the poor bird. This was a waste of time. I didn't know why I bothered coming here. Why did you try and run? Doing something illegal over here? I didn't expect him to answer, but saw the gears turning in his head.
"It's a reflex around cops. I ran with a bad crowd, but I'm out of that now. And I'm growing a certain plant. Only one for myself, so you can see why a detective randomly showing up freaked me out."
That was a fair answer. I honestly didn't care about any kind of illegal grow operation, as bad as that is to admit. I know at least 5 people in town that had a big operation going on. This guy would have made it onto his list to watch if he had anything like that on his property. And I was currently in the wrong here. I handcuffed him for, in a way, assaulting an officer. I also just arrived onto his land and could be treated as trespassing. I considered freeing him, but the shifty look on his face and the chickens within arm's reach of him made me reconsider.
"So, why did you come over here? Heard rumors I lived up to my last name."
He smiled, and I dismissed him. "Heard you could talk to the dead. I don't believe in that stuff. You're apparently good at finding things out. I was hoping you could look over a few case details and see if anything jumps out at you." He looked offended, even though I was giving him some praise. I really couldn't get a read off this guy.
"I don't talk to the dead. I'm a necromancer. It's different. And unless this case is very interesting, I don't have time playing gumshoe."
Well, this was a wasted trip. This guy clearly had issues calling himself a necromancer, as in raising skeletons and zombies from the grave. I was more offended by that idea than the chicken to the face. "All right, I'll leave you alone," I replied very quickly, wanting to get out of there.
"You don't believe I'm a necromancer, do you?"
The look I gave him was answer enough.
"I can prove it. Just go with me on this. It'll only take a few minutes, and all you need to do is hand me that wooden box."
I looked between him and the small box he was nodding towards. I thought he might be crazy and had some sort of weapon inside. I would check the box before handing it to him. I didn't want this to be a wasted trip, so I decided to humor him. I took a peek to see a dead chicken tucked inside, surrounded by wildflowers. He then stood up and traded the box for my handcuffs. I looked at him confused on how he got them off. I still had the key in my pocket. I was certain I closed the cuffs so tight even his thin wrists couldn't slip free.
Not my first time being cuffed.
He said with a wink that made me take a step away from him, wanting some distance. I watched him as he placed the box down on the hard-packed dirt. The lid came off and was put aside. He suddenly looked focused as he drew a very impressive, perfect circle around the box on the dirt.
I know you're thinking I'm some sort of crazy, handsome bachelor.
I thought one of those things.
I so rarely get to show off my skills. Rats got a hold of this poor girl earlier today. Working with fresh corpses costs less sacrifices to make move. For this, I already have everything I need. Some writing, a corpse, the body of the one who murdered the one I'm raising, and some magic words. Since you're here and watching, you need to say the words as well.
What words? Like Alakazam?
Don't be tacky. It's bibbidi bobbidi boo.
I really should have left by now. I was absolutely not going to say that, although I was impressed by the show he was making of it. With his finger, he drew more symbols and strange writing in the dirt. Inside the box under the flowers, he pulled a dead rat to place outside the box. It all very much looked like a ritual that could raise the dead. He impressed me with his artistic skills enough to stay and see where he was going with this. Within a few short minutes, he drew a complex system of symbols around the wooden box. I would let him say his magic words and then ditch. Arms crossed, I watched him still on the ground in front of the box, speaking in a language I didn't even have the faintest idea of. It sounded a bit fake. He wasn't being overly dramatic, as I expected him to be, though. I even humored him enough to say the very embarrassing childish words, although very softly after he glared at me when I didn't repeat them the first time. After it was all said and done, I thought the circle and symbols glowed very faintly. I assumed it was just a trick of the light. When nothing happened, I was about ready to leave. I took one step, then froze. The chicken in the box twitched. Its body started to spasm for a few seconds before going still. I wondered what kind of trick this was. If he drugged the poor thing to make it appear dead, I might have to take him in for animal cruelty. I watched as it sat up and clumsily fell out of its small coffin. On unsteady feet, the chicken started to take a few steps around, dead eyes seeing nothing. Listen, I don't know what you gave it to make it look this rough, but please put the poor thing out of its misery. Clearly this whole thing was some sort of scam. Dead things just don't get back up and start walking around. He either drugged it or trained a blind injured chicken.
BB II, please show him that neat trick I taught you.
I felt disgusted just being there. I needed him to listen and know just how much I disliked this chicken torture. Listen, I'm about to— holy shit! I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I tripped back on my own feet and fell back onto the hard ground. The chicken in front of me that looked very much dead started to turn its head around. Entirely around. I heard a disgusting creaking coming from the thing as its head did a 360-degree spin, then just kept slowly spinning. I knew owls could turn their heads like that, but didn't think chickens could. Even if they could, I doubted they could just keep twisting their necks around. Its neck started to look like a twisted rag, and it still didn't stop. I felt like I was going to be sick at the sight. I looked over at the strange man, expecting some sort of explanation. Instead, he just looked back at me with an expression on his face like a proud child showing off an art project, expecting a gold star. I just couldn't believe this man brought it back from the dead, even with the proof still spinning right in front of my face. For the next hour, he did everything possible to prove the chicken was real, dead and moving. I finally had to accept what I was seeing. Thousands of questions ran through my head, too many to ask at once. The man beat me to asking the first question.
What about that case you came here for?
I wanted you to try and dig up some dirt on a cold missing person case. The man who we think is most likely to have kidnapped Miss Mary died in prison, I explained, sitting in the dirt, completely shocked.
Oh? Where is he buried?
I only stayed a few more minutes after he asked such an ominous question. We made plans to meet up the next night to go grave robbing. I could look up where the suspect had been buried, and he wanted to finish the new chicken coop before he started a new job. As I was driving home, I did think about how insane this whole thing was. I couldn't believe I had not only let myself go over to his place, but had been talked into another meeting. Backing out was an option. I did not want to commit a crime or disrespect the dead. I also didn't want the family of the poor missing girl to not know her fate for much longer either. After all, I was only going to dig up a dead body with a necromancer. What's the worst thing that could happen? I arrived first at our agreed meeting spot, dressed in dark clothing and a shovel in my trunk. I felt like an idiot. For the 1000th time, I questioned myself on what the hell I had gotten into. As time passed and no necromancer, I was starting to get annoyed. I almost gave up the whole thing before I heard a car struggling to get down the road. So, the beat-up car of his could run. Being a necromancer and all, I guessed he could bring all sorts of things back from the dead. Seeing his iced coffee, I was even more annoyed he didn't value my time in the slightest. Follow behind me if your car can even make it. I know where he's buried. It's only an hour drive, I told him. I had gotten out of my car earlier to pace angrily around, waiting for him to show up. Go, right now. We haven't even discussed payment for this job yet, he said with a loud drink from his straw. Mr. Hot. I was so angry I could kill him. As much as I love being called Hot, I actually go by Neff. I really was going to end up killing him if he kept on like this. Neff, then. I know you're offering a service I'm fairly certain no one else can. However, don't you think closure for these families is payment enough? You can't eat closure. How about something simple? Dinner and a movie. Me and you. Nice steak place. And a rom-com after. I'm married, I lied. She doesn't need to know. And I have kids. Bigger lie. I love kids. I could barely stand being there talking to him. Spending a meal together would be impossible. That smug grin of his looked so fake on his face it was off-putting. I had a feeling he was trying his best to appear aloof and flirty, but for what reason? It was easy to see he didn't really want to go out. He just said it to be annoying. Why make me dislike him this much? If you do this and we get some leads, I'll go to a movie with you. An action one. And there must be a seat between us. Buy me a tub of popcorn and you have yourself a date. Let's go. And let's take your car. I didn't even have a chance to back out or stop him from grabbing a hefty duffel bag from his back seat and then climbing into the passenger seat of my car. He even honked the horn when I didn't follow after him fast enough. I just stared, trying to collect myself so I wouldn't deck him while we were driving. It was pitch dark when we arrived. I had a vague idea of where the grave would be. I couldn't see anything, but Neff walked around just fine in the dark. Risking a flashlight would not be a good idea in case any security saw us. I just needed to trust him that he could find the grave in the dark. It took a while before we stopped at a small marker bearing the name of the dead man we had questions for. I was carrying 2 shovels and held out one to Neff. He didn't take it. Necromancers never do their own digging. There was no sense arguing with him. I wanted to get the hell out of there as fast as I could. Wasting time trying to get him to do something he adamantly refused on wasn't something I came here for. I soon found out that digging was hard work. I took my coat off and rolled up my shirt sleeves. The cool night air chilled my sweat, making me feel hot and cool at the same time. If someone came across us now, I would not be able to talk myself out of this. I was digging a grave to steal a body. No way to get around that fact. Neff acted as a lookout. I suspect he mostly just sat on a tombstone, munching on some sort of snack he brought along. He did not offer to share. I did not let myself think about what I was doing. In my mind, I was just digging. I hadn't accepted the fact that there was going to be a corpse at the end of this task. A refusal to acknowledge that fact kept me going. My arms felt sore and my hands shook from the effort. The skin on my palms felt raw from the work. Only stopping a few times, I'd dug for hours. Morning may arrive before I was finished. Exhausted from the effort, I froze when my shovel hit wood. The realization of what I was doing finally sunk in after that hollow noise. I was digging a grave. I was standing above a dead body about to steal it because I was convinced Neff could resurrect it. Neff picked that moment to nearly give me a heart attack by jumping into the grave next to me. The coffin below us gave a groaning sound, threatening to crack from our combined weight.
"You're done. I can lift this out."
Neff was a thin man. I assumed he would just do what he needed and the zombie he created would crawl out of the grave. Whatever the plan was, I didn't know it. I just listened to him. Shortly, I found out why the coffin needed to be removed. The hole was just deep enough for it to be difficult for me to lift myself out. If I couldn't do it, then I had no idea how a zombie would have the strength to crawl out of its grave. After a few minutes of struggling, Neff gave me a hand by pushing me up and out of the grave. Although, I suspect he was trying to cop a feel. Taking a well-deserved break, I sat in the grass, waiting to see how Neff would manage getting himself and a coffin out without my help. It turned out to be very easy. Lifting the coffin up and over the top of the grave, he slid it onto the grass as if it weighed nothing. In one swift, graceful movement, he was out and brushing himself off. His arms were much thinner than mine, and he looked like he could barely support himself on his legs, let alone lift anything remotely heavy. "How did you?" I asked, a little bit dumbfounded.
"Oh, do you like what you see?"
Neff replied, posing, not missing a beat. Then he got serious. At least as serious as I've ever seen him. Opening up his duffel bag, he started to reach around inside, pulling out a strange assortment of items. Risking some light, I turned on the flashlight to see what he was doing. When Neff became focused, he was fast, wasting no movements. It was like he did this routine 100 times before. First, he adjusted the coffin, placing it in a spot where he had room to work. Using a bottle with a spout, he poured pure white sand in a circle. From where I was sitting, the circle looked perfect. I wondered how much practice it took to be able to make perfect circles every time. Around the circle, he made more of that strange writing, but only one line around. I thought raising a human would be more complicated than a chicken, and require the same amount, if not more, symbols. Those symbols look a little bit like it's from a cartoon my nephew likes. The main character is missing an arm, I think, I commented, remembering back to very quick glances at the show I'd seen.
"It's called anime." "And shut up."
I stayed silent and watched him work. From his bag he produced dried flowers, too many to have reasonably fit inside the bag. Ripping the coffin open with one hand, he started to arrange the flowers around the body. I couldn't bring myself to look inside. Digging up a body and looking at it are two different things. I expected there to be candles and chanting, maybe some chicken sacrifices. There was none of that. Just Neff writing more strange circles on the coffin in chalk. For some reason, he took some dirt from the grave and placed it inside a jar. I wasn't sure if that was for now or later. Out of his bag came the last two items. A bracelet made of what looked to be threads of silver, and a polished wooden board with a small matching wooden hammer. Facing away from me, he stood straight and began speaking some ancient language. He spoke a few sentences, ending the ritual off with knocking 3 times against his wooden board. I sat holding my breath, waiting to see what would happen. No lightning or dramatic flashing lights. Nothing extraordinary happened, aside from a dead man sitting up from his coffin. The sight nearly made me sick. Turning away, I needed to collect myself. Being a convicted killer, I wondered if anyone paid to have him embalmed, or if he was just tossed in the cheapest coffin and then put in a cemetery owned by the government. The image of his half-rotted corpse trying to get out from the coffin chilled me down to my very core. The wind blew the smell in my direction, making me retch. I'll admit, I wasn't doing as well as I thought I would be. I just wanted to get the answers and get out of that damn place. While I was averting my eyes, Neff put some car air fresheners on wherever he could hang them off the corpse. The mixture of those two smells made it worse. "Can you just ask him about his victim so we can get the hell out of here?" I nearly begged, still hunched over, almost about to get sick.
"What? Ask him? Does this thing look like it's able to talk?"
I could kill him. The shovel was so close. A few good swings would be all it would take. What do you mean he can't talk? What was the point of us doing all this if he can't talk? I was on the verge of becoming hysterical.
Did you really think I could bring back a dead to the point where they're talking and looking all shiny and new? Alright, I am that talented, but it takes a great number of sacrifices you do not want to make. And even if we went down that route to making him able to speak, he literally took his crimes to the grave. I make rotting flesh move, not bring people back to life.
I think he could tell I was getting angry and raised a hand to stop me so he could keep speaking.
Because I am so talented, I am able to cheat death and get some bits of information that rightfully should have died with him. Instead of a person telling me where he buried his victims, I'm connected directly to his past emotions and memories. I can't point to a map telling you who was buried where, but instead it's like a homing pigeon, you know? Instinctively, I now know which direction to go to find them.
I collapsed in the grass, dirty and tired, trying to figure out what Neff was getting at. We could still find the victims? Who knows how many were out there? I wished in that moment I asked more questions about how this whole thing worked beforehand. I could be more prepared for it. I let my eyes drift over the corpse, stumbling around. He was such a bastard in life, harming women and making families suffer by never revealing their resting place. At least now there was a chance to change that. So now what? You just walk around and point me in the right direction? I asked, sounding tired.
I prefer to drive.
I sat on the grass thinking as I saw that the sky was starting to lighten. We had to grab our zombie and leave soon. I didn't even think about how we should refill the grave before we left. I just wanted a shower and go to bed. You're not making up bullshit, right? Like this thing could talk, but you're just making us do the long method to make me hang around for longer. Neff let out an offended gasp at my comment.
I have never been so insulted in my life. There is no truth to that thought at all. I am certainly not keeping you around hoping I have future chances of accidentally touching your butt,
he said with fake offense. I really needed a shower. I stood up, brushing myself off as best I was able. A horrible thought came to me. Does this mean we need to take him with us? I asked, looking over at the rancid-smelling, stumbling corpse. Neff smiled and nodded, and I groaned at the fact I'll never get the smell out of my car. It took some frantic planning on my part to get things arranged. After dropping Neff back at his car and watching him drive off with our new zombie, I started on getting some time off work. I had no idea how many undiscovered victims were out there, and how long it would take to find them. They could all be local or all over the country. I was able to get a week off work, even though I was the new lead detective in the department. But even with such an important job title, it wasn't as if there was much need for me in the area. I arranged that I would pick up my Necromancer and the zombie at his place early the next day. And it should give me lots of time to get well rested and prepared for our strange road trip. To my immense annoyance, I found Neff not at home the next day. This was back before cell phones really became popular. I had one for work, but Neff didn't. I waited at his place, petting the chickens and watching as the zombie kept bumping into things. He was on a leash, and Neff dressed him in a large sun hat and sunglasses. At a distance, you couldn't tell he was dead. When I heard Neff's ancient car driving down the dirt road, I went out to the front to meet him, ready to give him a piece of my mind. I said bright and early. I snapped at him before he even got out of the car.
This is bright and early for me. Besides, I needed supplies,
he replied, not looking concerned at my anger. Again, he bought an iced coffee. That pissed me off. His supplies were just a mountain of snacks he piled into my back seat along with his duffel bag. I brought a few changes of clothing, not knowing how long we'd be gone for. I let him usher the zombie into the trunk and sprayed nearly an entire can of air freshener before closing it. Doesn't he need to see where he's going? I asked when the trunk closed.
No, he's like a homing beacon. Get in. We're late getting started.
Knocking that iced coffee out of his hand was very tempting. Neff got into my car on the driver's side. I don't know why I thought I would be the one driving. He knew where we were headed, but I still didn't trust him driving my car. I needed to let it go and accept it. I cringed as he adjusted his seat to accommodate his long legs. It would take me forever getting my seat back to the right position.
Let's get this road trip started,
Neff said as he pulled out of the driveway and along the road. He shoved a mixed CD into the player and foreign language music blasted. I shut it off. This is not a road trip, I hissed at him.
Darling, you're looking for dead bodies off the books. Driving across country looking for murder victims and not getting paid for it is total road trip material.
Before I could disagree, he put his music back on, turning the volume up so loud I couldn't hear myself think of a reply. This trip is going to be a long and frustrating one. I needed to let him have some small victories, or else I would not be able to get through it.
Well, that brings us to the halfway point of today's tale. Will our heroes find the missing girls and lay their souls to rest? Will Charles ever lighten up? Will Neff get to touch any more butts? Find out in the thrilling conclusion, starting now.
On a road trip, finding murder victims, only stopping for a few hours at awful hotels and eating greasy fast food is not my idea of a vacation. In order to take time off for my job, I faked a family emergency and then dipped into my vacation time. My boss called in to check up on me, asking if everything was all right and if I was enjoying some time off. I wasn't officially on the case, and I couldn't tell him I was driving around with a honest-to-God necromancer. Telling my boss some lies to get him off the phone, I met back up with Neff. He was shoving a mountain of burgers into his face. I could barely stomach greasy fries at that point, let alone a full meal. He must have a stomach of steel. We found the next grave site, but ran into a problem. It was along a very popular hiking and camping area. The woods had a steady stream of people along the entrances. Neff vaguely knew where the buried bodies were, but needed the zombie to guide him to the right spot. But the zombie was, well, a walking dead body. He looked in rough shape and smelled horrible from spending days in a hot car trunk. We couldn't risk anyone seeing it, let alone smelling it. We had to come back to the woods at night. Once we find the gravesite, we can stash the zombie in the trunk and away from any unsuspecting camper from stumbling on our undead guide. We followed the plan and found the site in the dark. It looked just like a normal clearing in the woods, apart from a large X spray painted on a rock. I shuddered when my flashlight beam shone on it. I knew there was a body buried there. Even after getting tangled up with a necromancer, seeing a zombie walk around and uncovering some bones, I still got a chill thinking about the dead waiting to be found. My stomach was tied up in knots, and it was not from my terrible diet from the past few days. Neff left me in the clearing alone to guard the site as he took the zombie back to the car. It was an hour or so until sunrise. We needed to find the site at night, but Neff didn't want to dig yet in case I didn't see what I was doing and damage the body with my shovel. This was not the proper process, and we should really do our best to limit the damage to the crime scene. I waited in the dark woods, skin crawling, listening to sounds around me. Even normal forest sounds seem threatening when you're alone in the dark near a grave. I just wanted the sun to come up and us to finish our task and get the hell out of there. I heard the sound of twigs snapping and it made me jump. I shone my flashlight over, trying to see if Neff was the one making the sounds. I was positive I wasn't being paranoid. I was hearing someone walking around in the trees. Mentally, I chided myself. We were in an area with people camping. Someone might have left their tent for a washroom run, and I could just be scaring them as much as they were scaring me. My hands started to sweat as I kept moving my flashlight around, trying to see who was walking just beyond the trees. Soon, the footsteps stopped. My heart was beating so loud I thought it would burst. I sensed something behind me. It was hard to explain. I didn't hear anything, I just knew something was now at my back. Turning on my heel so fast I nearly twisted it, I looked at the large rock behind me. Now, sitting on top, above the large painted X, was something that nearly made me turn and run. A small object, looking like a stick man made of what I assumed to be small bones, tied to a star, also made of bones. I'd seen the Blair Witch, and I knew stickmen charms were bad news. Taking one step back, without taking my eyes off the thing, I started to go towards the edge of the clearing. Strong hands grabbed my shoulders from behind. I screamed, very similar to a little frightened girl, and dropped my flashlight as I swung around, trying to get free of those hands. A loud, cackling laugh frightened me more until I recognized it. Neff was behind me, doubled over laughing so hard he sounded like he was choking. I felt my face turn red in the dark. Unable to control my rage, I started to kick at his shins, expressing how I felt about him sneaking up behind me and grabbing me. He dodged, only to trip over his own feet, fell to the ground still cackling. He could choke to death on his laughter for all I cared. "You're a complete ass," I hissed at him. I walked over to the rock, grabbed the stick man and tossed it at him. "Shit like this isn't funny." It took him a while, but he finally recovered enough to sit up with a charm in his hand. He rubbed his eyes looking at the stick man.
Valak was here. He told me he finished our request and wanted to leave you a gift as an apology for nearly killing you. He's really shy, so when you almost saw him, he panicked.
Shy? That massive, terrifying wolf creature was shy? I took back the charm, looking it over. It may be a gift, but it still gave me the creeps. "What is it for?" I asked, looking at the creepy thing.
"It's a good luck charm. It absorbs all your bad luck. After a few days, you should burn it, and it'll burn away the bad luck it took in. If you wait too long, the charm might take in too much and it'll break, spilling all that bad luck back onto you."
I turned it over in my hand, wondering what made Valak think of such a thing. I couldn't help but feel I was already lucky. I stumbled into someone who could close a few cold cases and was willing to do so. I tucked the charm away, reminding myself to burn it tomorrow night. "Neff, why are you here? You've invested so much time and energy into this. Finding these girls is my job, but for you..." We still had time until sunrise and until we could start digging. I couldn't help but ask a question that had been bothering me for a while.
"You're my type."
No, seriously. He looked at me in the dim flashlight beam. He had his sunglasses off and I could see his red eyes looking off into the distance, trying to decide on something. He finally looked back at me with an expression on his face I couldn't place.
"You showed up at a good time. I have nothing going on right now. The gate is closed, the deep creatures are peacefully asleep, and I'm not needed to keep the world balanced. I used up a lot of my strength recently, and I'm pretty weak right now. I should be resting considering how easy it would be to kill me, but I guess I'm just tired of dealing in end-of-the-world stuff. Doing a simple job with some nice eye candy isn't bad once in a while." I would let the eye candy comment go, because I could feel he was finally being honest with me. I also knew if I pressed him, asking him about any of the things he mentioned, I would not get an answer. Anything called the deep creatures is well beyond my pay grade. The end-of-the-world stuff was not for me. As the hours passed by, I tried asking him some other questions, attempting to get any more facts about himself. I was shot down and Neff was done being honest and sharing. He was a bit of a mystery and wanted to stay like that. When the sun rose, I stopped talking and went about the somber task of digging yet another grave. This one deeper than the others. I'd gotten a bit skilled at digging in the past few days. Even though it was deeper, it didn't take me as long as I thought. It barely started to warm up when Neff stopped me and did the process of looking in the dirt to find another skull looking back at us. He took a photo and called his large crow, Carl, this time. But he did not send Carl away. Instead, he looked over at me. "This is Mary, the girl from your case." I want to delay sending the photo to the local police until we're done finding graves. I have a feeling we only have one more after this one. Her killer buried her wallet with her. With that found, you'll be called in and won't be free to find the last site."
Neff explained, his large bird perched on his arm, flapping its wings to adjust itself. I nodded while looking over at where I'd just dug. I didn't want to leave her. It made me feel sick knowing she was going to still be in the ground and not brought home for a little while longer. But for the sake of another girl somewhere, I needed to leave Mary alone. Just then, I was starting to think I wasn't cut out for my job. I could handle being a detective in a small town where nothing happened. If I worked in a larger town and this was my day-to-day life, seeing bodies, I just couldn't do it. Neff told Carl to deliver the photo later, and he guided me back to the car. I was ready to sit down, get washed up, and find the last site. I just wanted this to be over. When Neff got to the car, he didn't get inside. Instead, he leaned against it, looking over at the early birds arriving on the hiking trail.
"I've held back some important information. With these sites being discovered, you'll hear the news soon. I didn't want you to be extra stressed. You needed to be able to deal with what we're doing, and, no offense, you're a cute little country boy playing detective. I like that about you. So small and pure, acting like a tough grown man."
I punched his arm. It was a reflex at that point. "Lay it on me. If I can handle being around you, I can handle whatever you're going to tell me."
"The first grave site you dug up, there wasn't one body. There was 4. Neff said in a low tone.
My entire body prickled and felt cold. Tears suddenly started to sting my eyes, but I blinked them back. 4 bodies. 4 girls buried away for that long. Neff was right. I felt sick and I didn't want to think about it.
The site with the fragments was only the one girl. It was a rush job, and that's why she was buried so poorly. An animal got to her. This site has 6 bodies. Mary was not alone all these years."
I don't know how Neff could give me the news so coldly. He was talking about double-digit murder victims, but it sounded like he was telling me the weather. I turned away from him, my stomach empty, but still felt like I was going to be sick. I hunched over, head down, hands on my knees, trying to understand what he just said. 11 girls. So many loved ones hurt and waiting, all because of one evil man. And he was evil. I knew that for certain in that moment. I looked over the direction of the trunk and where we stored the walking corpse. I've never hated anything or anyone in my entire life until then. I hated that man for taking so many lives, for hurting so many people. I was glad he died, and everything he was died along with him. Someday he would be forgotten, his name never to be repeated. I swore then, if I could help it, I would never use his name to try and speed up the process of having time erase him from the world. When I felt better, I straightened up and looked behind me to see Neff with his arms open. He wiggled his fingers, beckoning to me to go to him for an embrace. I ignored him and got into the car. One more site to go. Neff was right. It was harder going towards a grave when you knew there was a few bodies waiting, instead of just one. I refused to stay at the motel and wanted us to stay on the road and keep going. Neff would just have to deal with me being dirty for another day or so. Aside from bathroom breaks, we didn't stop. We drove into farm country. Corn and cow fields flew by. My cell phone didn't have a signal, and the radio was more static than music. We truly were in the middle of nowhere, a perfect place for forgotten bodies. Because there were so few people, we could take our zombie guide out without any worry. I now had another reason to feel sick when I looked at him. The car got stuck a few times along a dirty and bumpy road, until Neff finally parked and made us all get out. One last trip, one last sight. Neff could sense how I was feeling and wisely didn't attempt on flirting. In fact, he was acting a bit different the past day. He gave me the silent treatment before, after I puked on his shirt, but this was colder. He seemed tense. There was a chance the idea of finding so many victims was getting to him as well. He was carrying a shovel, and I followed behind him. We found ourselves in an overgrown field. At some point in the past, the field looked to be part of some farmland before the owner just gave up on it. I reached for the shovel to start digging, but Neff walked out of my reach. He paced around, finding a spot, and to my shock, he started to dig. He refused so many times it was a waste of breath to ask, and yet there he was, completely focused on his task. The hot sun not bothering him as he shoveled away dirt in such a perfect pace. Give him a day and he might dig halfway to the earth's core. Not speaking to him, feeling as if this was something he needed to do. It didn't take long, but he uncovered a grave. A small bundle of fabric that made my throat close. It was so small. I feared he cut the victim up before burying her. Brushing away dirt, he revealed another small fabric bundle beside the first one. But he did not uncover them. Neff just looked down with a strange expression on his face. He looked almost sad at what he was seeing. I wanted to get his attention, to make him look away from the sight, but no words came to mind. There was really nothing I could say in the moment. Still, I opened my mouth to say his name when a loud crack rang through the air. I jumped at the sound as more rang off. I knew those were gunshots, some sort of hunting rifle sounding close by. I grew up where hunting was common, so I knew the sound. I looked behind me, trying to see where the first shot came from, then forced my eyes back at Neff, telling him to get out of the open. My heart stopped when I saw it was far too late. His sunglasses exploded from his face as the second shot came. I was in such a state of shock seeing my friend collapse to the ground, I didn't even register I was in danger as well. When my body did move, it was to make the stupid choice of running to him. I should have left him and ran for cover. I should have grabbed the shovel for some sort of weapon. I should have done anything but run over to Neff and haul him into my arms to see his damaged face spilling blood all over my clothing. I just couldn't accept that he was hurt. My mind snapped thinking if I could just get him out of there, everything would be fine. It was Neff, after all. He could raise the dead. It was impossible. A bullet or two to the face could kill him. Hooking my arms under his, I tried dragging him away. Fast footsteps came running up behind me, and I was far too late to move out of the way as someone hit my head from behind. Hard enough to knock me out. I woke up, head pounding and feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Everything hurt and felt too heavy to move. I've never had such pain before. For a few minutes, the pain was so much I had forgotten about everything. Soon the horrible memories came rushing back. I jerked my head up to look around, shouting out Neff's name, trying to find him. My arms and legs were taped tightly to a chair. I struggled to get free while darting my heavy head around, taking in my surroundings. It looked like a rundown old wooden cabin. Signs of someone living there was scattered around. It smelled musty and old. In the dim light, my eyes landed on 2 figures on the floor. One was a zombie, now not moving and looking just as dead as when we first dug him up. The other was my friend, dried blood over his face, his one eye completely destroyed, while the other stared over at me and yet not seeing anything. Neff! No! My voice cracked as I yelled for him. I couldn't control myself or even think. I didn't care if the person who did all this could hear me. I just needed to get the hell out of that chair and to my friend. While I struggled, I wasn't paying attention as a man entered the small room. He was dirty and looked homeless. Rifle over one shoulder, he came to me, swinging the butt of the gun in my face, scrambling my brain for a few seconds.
"Who the hell are you two?"
he yelled, sounding as stressed as I felt.
"And how did you find the bodies?"
My head was swimming. Nothing made sense. Who the hell was this guy? Why did he shoot at us? And why wasn't Neff just getting up and taking care of this? He wasn't human. A bullet or two to the face shouldn't kill him. I had to push the thought of my friend from my mind for at least a few minutes to figure out who this man was. He paced around, looking strung out on something. He was muttering to himself while looking over in my direction. Suddenly, the thought snapped in my mind.
"Your dead partner told us,"
I replied, voice sounding hoarse. He froze, eyes wide in fear, and looked at the dead man we brought along, then back at me. For my answer, he punched my face again and started to shake the chair.
"The dead don't talk. Who the hell are you?"
He screamed, his rancid breath nearly making me sick. "It's the truth. That man you shot is a necromancer. He'll be getting up any second now to set you straight." I hoped I sounded confident, or at least somewhat threatening. The man stopped shaking me. He stared at me, trying to see if I was lying or not. Slowly, he let go and started towards Neff's body. To my horror, he took his rifle off his shoulder and shot Neff a few more times for good measure. I shouted and screamed at him to stop. I strained against the chair, but it and my bond stayed.
"There. Now, I'll ask you again before I kill you. How did you find the bodies? I never told anyone, and he never told anyone about me. How did you know?"
Tears came to my eyes. I wanted to force them down and handle this. I was a grown man, for God's sake. I should be able to handle this. At least now I knew who this man was. At some point, him and the other killer joined up. It wasn't unheard of. And for some reason, when one of them was caught, neither of them ratted on each other. One man died in prison while the other was left to be free and keep killing. But I didn't understand how Neff didn't know about this man. Did he know and think the partner was dead already? Or moved on and wasn't a threat? He hinted before he could see how the woman was murdered. If he had access to those kids' memories, surely he would have seen there was a second person. I told you already. He's a necromancer. I was in a poor state. There wasn't any kind of fight left in me, and I knew I was going to die. I couldn't get free, and my friend was dead. This man just needed to shoot me once, and it was all over. Instead, he hit me again, this time breaking my nose. Blood poured down my face, but I refused to cry out in pain.
"That's it. I'll bury you with those little girls you tried so hard to find, and get the hell out of here."
He sounded strangely calm as he leveled the rifle right in front of my face. At this distance, there was no question of him missing. I was a second away from death before a tremor hit the house. Everything shook and rattled while a thundering sound came from outside. It made him drop his rifle in fear and look around. I've never been through an earthquake and was very confused by what just happened. As the shaking stopped, he went to pick up his weapon, but before his hand could reach it, his entire body was kicked away and well across the room, slamming hard against a wall. To my immense relief, Neff stood in front of me, face healed. I didn't question how he was alive or what happened. I was just glad he was alive and standing. He wasted no time tearing the tape away and getting him out of the chair. "Christ, Neff! Do you have any idea how worried I was about you?" I snapped at him. I expected him to give me a flirty answer back or, well, even look at me. He kept his eyes cold and on his task of freeing me. When I was standing, he took my chin roughly to look over the damage.
"Let me take care of this."
He didn't even sound like himself. Did the bullet do some damage to his head after all? I let out a yell of surprise when he ripped my shirt open with one hand, keeping my head in place and holding my chin. I used all my strength trying to pry his hand off, but his grip was like a vice. He covered his palm with the blood from my nose and slammed it against my bare chest. It felt like a shock wave, as if something traveled through my body, taking up all the air from my lungs. When he let go, I coughed, trying to refill them and recover. I found aside from trying to breathe, all the other pains went away. My nose felt fine and my head no longer pounded in pain. Roughly, he grabbed my arm and started to drag me out of the room. "Neff, what the hell?" I demanded, only to get no answer. I planted my feet down, but it didn't do anything. "We need to get that guy tied down or something. He killed those girls along with that other... Neff, come on. Let's go back and deal with this." He kept dragging me along, not looking over at me. It scared me. Deep down, I felt like if I didn't get him talking, something awful was going to happen. I was dragged along out of a run-down cabin into a grassy field, still trying to dig my feet in. He finally stopped a few feet out of the cabin. He let go of my arm, but did not turn to face me.
"You are going to leave. Go back to your life. We never met." You have nothing to do with this. I'll deal with him in my own way.
Neff answered, his tone chilling my blood, even while in the hot sun. Deep down, I knew what he meant by his own way. Neff wasn't human. That man wasn't just going to be killed. Neff could torture him in ways my mind couldn't even imagine. For what that bastard had done, I almost wanted to let him go through with it. But I hated how Neff was acting. This wasn't him. If he went down this road, he would lose a part of himself. I knew that much. We're taking him in so he can be judged for his crimes. I may not be a good detective, but I'm still a man of the law. I can't let you kill him, I said sternly, standing my ground. Neff looked over his shoulder at me. When his intimidating look didn't faze me, he finally turned around to look down on me.
That last grave was for children.
My hands shook and bile came to my throat. Those small fabric bundles weren't because the bodies were cut apart. I understood why Neff was so deeply angry. He saw what those two did to them, and how many were in that grave. If anyone deserved to be tortured, that man did. But Neff didn't deserve to be the one carrying it out. I still have to follow the law. He needs to be in court for what... Suddenly, Neff snapped, his red eyes blazing. He felt taller, and the sun around us dimmed. His teeth became sharper, and his hands curled, looking like claws.
I am not human. I have seen his crimes and have judged him guilty. This man needs to be erased from history in the most painful way possible.
He didn't even sound human anymore. The person I considered to be a friend was becoming something else. Dark and threatening, he growled down at me, and I felt so small in that moment. Still, I needed to get through to him. It's not your place. You can't take this away from the families of the... Again, I was cut off. His face twisted into something, and the ground started to rumble under my feet. His face grew so dark, and in the sudden lack of light around us, I could only see his red eyes and snarling mouth.
Why should they get a sense of closure when I never did? If I could not rip apart the men who violated my little one, I shall tear apart any vile piece of shit I come across. That is what I am owed. I do not care if I am taking that away from anyone else. These men are going to get what they deserve, and I shall not stop until...
The world was dark and shaking from his rage. I knew if he kept going, he would turn into something else. Dark shapes looking almost like wings started to appear behind him. Neff was powerful, angry, and yet deeply scarred. I pushed aside my fear of him. I reached out and pulled him close to me. The world and Neff returning to normal. The sun shone down again as I let him hide his face in my shoulder. If you keep going like this, you won't be able to come back from it, I told him, my hands shaking, but I kept them still on his back.
You'll have to go on that date with me if we keep that guy alive and have him arrested.
His voice was muffled and he was trying to get back to his normal flirting tone, but he sounded weak. I'll go the whole 9 yards for you if it keeps you from doing anything stupid. We both let out a weak laugh at my offer. Raising his head, he looked down at me. I really thought I'd gotten through to him and we were just going to drag the murderer in the cabin to the local cops. A gunshot came from behind us. Neff pushed me aside and I tripped into the grass. The man was at the cabin door, trying to reload his rifle, but his fingers fumbling. I got up to grab Neff and get the hell out of there when I slammed into an invisible wall, separating us. The man finally got his weapon loaded and fired again. The bullet exploded against the same wall I was banging my fist against, trying to get to my friend. Neff knew this wall was here the entire time. I don't know how or when he created it. No matter how hard I pushed, I couldn't get through. Neff turned back to look at me with a hint of regret on his face. He already made his decision. Staying meant becoming a monster, and Neff was staying. I could no longer talk him out of it. But I think he was glad there was someone who cared about him enough to try. Turning away from me, his body twisted and turned dark. He moved too fast for me to get a good look at what he became. Whatever he truly looked like, it was dark and sleek, and something no human eye should ever lay eyes on. The black shape blurred across the grass right towards the dirty man and his rifle. I heard screams as the shape dragged him inside the cabin, and I couldn't do a damn thing about it. I really should have. After a few hours of trying to get past the invisible wall, I turned away to find the car. The sun set when I did find it. I was so exhausted I just collapsed in the back seat. Neff left behind his mixed CD. The music stayed on for a little while because it grew on me during the trip. Found somewhere to get cleaned up, then drove back to that cabin. I parked the car down the road and waited, then repeated the process for the next 3 days. My boss may have been trying to get in contact with me, but I didn't care. The very least I could do was take a friend home. Near sunset on the 3rd day, Neff came out of the cabin. I could see him in the dimming light where I parked. Getting out of the car, I waited for him to take the long walk down towards me. His clothing was torn and covered in dry blood that he looked as if he tried to clean. His hair no longer tied back and sunglasses lost. He lost so much weight in those few days, weight he could not afford to lose. When he stopped a few steps away, he didn't even look up at me. Along with some pounds, he lost something else in those 3 days, something he would never get back. Holding out a bottle of water for him, he took it in weak hands. We didn't leave. I just leaned against the car with him, looking at the colors of the changing sky. There were so many questions I wanted to ask. Not a single one felt right to say. "I lost my daughter," he said, finally, after taking a few sips from his water. "Adopted?" I asked carefully. "What do you think?" At least he still had some humor left. "The men who did things to her died in an accident before I got to them. They didn't even feel any pain. They just died. How unfair is that? I was human a long time ago. I became what I am because of that." "To bring her back?" "No. Even I knew she was never coming back. No matter how much you love someone, death is the end. They don't come back. You can bring back parts of them, hints of what was, but never that person. I couldn't bear seeing parts of her. It's like you find an object that belonged to your deceased loved one, and it just reminds you all over again that they're gone. No, not her. I wanted to bring back parts of the ones who harmed her and make them suffer. I thought if even traces of the ones responsible for her death felt my wrath, I would feel something. Instead, I became this. As simple as that." Again, I was at a loss for words. Nothing I said could help him at this point, no matter how much I wanted. "Come on, I'll take you home." At least that small gesture was enough for Neff. He gave me a hint of a smile and got inside the back seat of the car to curl up and sleep for the trip home. We didn't talk much on the way back, just took turns driving when needed. It was a depressing trip back, to say the least. I knew a case would be ready to be closed when I got back. So many bodies were being found. They finally noticed the grave of the serial killer was robbed, so when I got back, I needed to do my best to avert suspicion away from myself for that crime. I would have my hands full. Not at all what I thought I would have to deal with, taking over the lead detective role in a sleepy small town. I dropped by Neff's place first. I didn't even check my phone, but I knew it was full of messages telling me to get the hell back already. Neff got out and stretched. Neither of us knew how to say goodbye or what to say to each other after everything. "Are you free next Friday?" I asked him finally. "I might be. Why do you ask?" he said with some of his old playful manner coming back. "Let's go out. Dinner and a movie. Let's say 5. A fancy steak place or some rom-com or whatever. If you play your cards right, I might even put out on the first date." That last part was a lie and we both knew it. At least I got him to finally smile. I drove off, leaving him to his chickens and with a promise to see each other again. I was right to assume I was going to be busy. Friday came and Neff called my office. I knew I had too much on my plate and we put the date off until things died down a little. A few months passed by and I finally cleared a day. We called each other from time to time, but when I couldn't get in contact with him for a week, panic started to rise. I drove out to his place to check it out. His rusted, beat-up car remained in the driveway, but it was far too quiet at his place. I ran to the backyard to find it empty of chickens. Their coops still stood, clean, as if never used before. Not even knocking, I opened its unlocked door and started looking through the old farmhouse, and found nothing. Just a dusty, empty house with sparse furniture. It appeared as if no one had lived there for years. Maybe Neff never stayed there. He just dropped by and used the backyard for his failed chicken army. I kept looking for him. Months turned into years. Access to information got better, but I still couldn't find any traces of my friend. No matter how hard I looked, I knew if he didn't want to be found, I wouldn't come across him. But still, in the back of my mind, I felt like we would meet again. I owed him a date after all. I was positive that someday he would come by to collect on it.